1997, 2,000 miles. Underwater microphones on opposite sides of the Pacific catch the same sound. It is low, huge, and loud enough to make the ocean feel like it just cleared its throat. Then somebody calls it the bloop, which is funny only until you hear it. You might picture a whale the size of a stadium, a secret submarine, something with too many teeth. And after all that, the culprit is ice. You are probably thinking that is a very expensive way to discover a glacier can be noisy. Fair, but that is the pattern down here. A blurry sonar picture becomes a UFO. A dead animal becomes a myth. A place with no sunlight turns out to be crowded with life. The deep ocean keeps handing you a horror trailer, then making you read the technical manual. How does a sound cross an ocean? Why did a supposedly extinct fish show up in a fishing net? How can an entire patch of sea shine like a stadium light? And which mystery still refuses to give us an answer? Before you let the word explained relax you, one honest warning. A real explanation is sometimes stranger than the rumor. Sometimes it is also just more boring. Both are good news. First, you get the bloop. In 1997, NOAA researchers listening for underwater volcanoes picked up a signal, unlike their usual catalog of earthquakes, ships, whales, and ice. Hydrophones more than 2,000 miles apart recorded it. That distance matters. If you hear your neighbor drop a pan, you know it is a pan. If you hear something through an entire ocean basin, your brain starts applying for monster insurance. The sound had a steep rise and a long falling tail. When you speed it up so human ears can hear it, it does not sound like a creature. It sounds like a wet rubber band being dragged through the apocalypse. The source appeared to be somewhere in the southern Pacific, close enough to Antarctica to make the map look empty. That empty patch did a lot of work on you. No known animal should make a sound that powerful. So the bloop became a legend. People gave it cartoon teeth. Games turned it into a boss fight. The ocean, which already has enough PR problems, got blamed for a giant animal nobody had seen. NOAA kept listening. By 2005, instruments closer to Antarctica were recording ice quakes with spectrograms that matched the bloop almost embarrassingly well. 1. No monster. 2. No submarine. 3. An iceberg fractures, calves, or grinds. The energy reaches you through water for thousands of miles. Your ancient sea god is a stressed piece of Antarctic ice. That does not make it small. Some icequakes are powerful enough to be detected at ranges over 5,000 kilometers. You are not hearing a tiny crack. You are hearing a moving mountain decide it has had enough. If the bloop is still a sea monster in your head, keep it there. It is rent-free and probably quieter than reality. But if you prefer the version where the planet is weird without needing tentacles, because the next sound came from something even more physical. On March 1st, 1999, another hydrophone array recorded a long, eerie call called Julia. A related sound got the even less reassuring name, Slow Down. You might expect two new monsters. The ocean was actually giving us one very large iceberg, stuck in a very bad parking spot. NOAA traced the most likely origin toward Antarctica. The best explanation is that a huge iceberg had run aground on the seafloor. Its underside, called a keel, was dragging against rock as currents and ice movement pushed it along. You can picture a building-sized fingernail scraping a planet-sized chalkboard. Then put the chalkboard underwater, where sound travels much farther than it does through air. That is Julia, not an animal calling from the dark. Friction, ice, stone. Three things that do not care whether you have a comforting explanation ready. There is a useful rule here. The ocean is not silent. It is packed with sound, and most of it comes from ordinary forces doing extraordinary work. Water amplifies the scale. Distance removes the context. By the time the sound reaches you, you are trying to identify a train from one loose bolt. Now you can watch what happens when the mystery is not a sound, but a picture. In 2011, a Swedish exploration team released a sonar image from the floor of the Baltic Sea. You could see a giant circular object. People saw a disk. They saw steps. They saw a crashed spacecraft because apparently aliens crossed interstellar space and then picked the Baltic for parallel parking. The image was a sonar scan, not a clean photograph. Sonar measures sound bouncing back from the seafloor. It is excellent for finding shapes. It is also excellent at turning a rough rock formation into whatever your brain already wants to see. You have done this with clouds. The Baltic anomaly just had worse lighting and a better publicist. Later, rock samples from the area were described as ordinary geological material, and geologists pointed to glacial and post-glacial processes as the likely explanation for the formation. You still have no independent evidence of an artificial craft, no metal shell, no alien door, no ancient engine that somehow forgot to bring a manual. Here is the clean version. The original scan is interesting. The claim that it is a spacecraft is not supported. The exact history of every ridge and contour is less dramatic than the headline, and that is fine. A natural feature does not need to be boring just because it cannot abduct you. The next discovery takes you down the opposite path. It started as a monster story. Then a camera finally showed the animal, and the real thing was somehow better. For centuries, sailors reported giant tentacles, crushed boats, and something called the Kraken. You had pieces of giant squid, beaks from sperm whale stomachs, bodies that washed ashore after the ocean had finished with them. What nobody had was a clear look at a living adult giant squid in its own world. That changed in 2012 when a team led by Japanese researcher Tsunemi Kubadera filmed a live giant squid from a submersible near the Ogasawara Islands. You did not get a movie monster. You got Architeuthis, pale and alert, moving through the deep with eyes that look built to catch the faintest possible light. The film mattered because it replaced a pile of leftovers with behavior. The animal was not a myth stitched together from dead specimens. It was a real predator in a real habitat. It used long feeding tentacles. It watched. It moved with much less chaos than the Kraken stories promised. That is always the ocean's joke. You wait hundreds of years to see the beast, and it behaves more professionally than most people on the freeway. Giant squid are still hard to observe because their home is dark, deep, and inconveniently far from a good Wi-Fi signal. But the basic mystery closed. There is no need to invent a creature larger than the evidence. The evidence gave you one large enough. Now you can take that lesson and apply it to a fish that did not vanish at all. It just hid in the gap between fossils and fishing boats. For a long time, coelacanths were known only from fossils. Their lines seemed to disappear from the fossil record around 66 million years ago, at the end of the age of dinosaurs. So you would reasonably file them under gone. Then, in 1938, a living coelacanth showed up in a fishing trawl off South Africa. Marjorie Courtney Latimer, a museum curator in East London, noticed the fish among the catch. It had thick, lobed fins that looked almost too old to be moving. Scientists later named it Latimeria chalumnae after her. You did not get a fish returning from extinction. It had never left. Science had simply not been looking in the right place. That distinction matters. Fossils are not security footage. A gap in the fossil record means you have a gap in the fossil record. It does not mean every animal in that gap politely stopped existing. The coelacanth is not frozen in time either. It is a living animal with its own evolutionary history, not a museum exhibit that escaped. Still, you can understand the shock. Imagine finding a flip phone in your kitchen that still receives messages from the Cretaceous. That was the coelacanth moment. A fish that belonged in stone was calmly swimming in the Indian Ocean. The deep sea has another way of breaking your mental filing system. It can build a full ecosystem in total darkness, then make you realize sunlight was always optional. In 1977, scientists exploring the Galapagos Rift found hydrothermal vents. You can think of them as cracks in the ocean floor where seawater meets hot rock and magma, heats up, and comes back out loaded with minerals. Some vent fluids can reach more than 340 degrees Celsius. They do not boil because the pressure at that depth is doing a very convincing impression of a locked lid. The surprise was not only the heat. Around the vents were huge tube worms, clams, crabs, and other animals living where sunlight never reaches. You have been taught one basic food chain shortcut. Plants use sunlight, animals use plants or other animals. Down here, bacteria use chemical energy from compounds such as hydrogen sulfide. They make the foundation. Everything else builds upward from there. That process is chemosynthesis. It means you can get an ecosystem running on chemistry from inside the planet rather than light from above it. The vents did not prove where life began. They did prove that life has more backup plans than your average office printer. And the strangest part is how ordinary the animals can look from a distance. You see a red tube worm. You see a clam. Put them around a chimney blasting mineral-rich fluid from the crust, 2 miles below the surface, and suddenly your basic nature documentary needs an industrial safety officer. You may have thought the deep sea was empty because it is dark. Darkness is not emptiness. It is a curtain. Sometimes the curtain is hiding a chemical city. Then you get nights when the ocean removes the curtain and lights itself up. Sailors have described Milky Seas for centuries. You are not looking at sparkling water near a beach. You are looking at entire regions of ocean glowing a pale blue-white, sometimes so evenly that the horizon disappears and the ship seems to float over snow. It sounds like a story somebody tells after too little sleep and too much rum. For a long time, that was close to all you had. Then, low-light satellite sensors caught a huge event south of Java in 2019. The glow covered more than 100,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Iceland, and persisted across many nights. A boat in the area also reported seeing the light. The sea legend got a receipt from space. The likely source is bioluminescent bacteria. In enormous numbers, they can produce a steady glow rather than the quick flashes you see from plankton near shore. The exact conditions that make a Milky Sea start, spread, and last are still being studied. That is the difference between a solved sighting and a solved system. We know it happens. We are still learning how the ocean decides to turn on the overhead lights. And if you like mysteries that end with data instead of a guy pointing at a blurry circle, subscribe. The last chapter is not a myth that waited a century to be explained. It happened this year, and it shows how much the deep sea is still keeping in reserve. In April 2026, CSYRO announced that marine taxonomists had identified more than 110 fish and invertebrate species from the Coral Sea that are new to science. What you need to know is where the samples came from. Deep water in the Coral Sea Marine Park, between 200 and 3,000 meters down. The initial count could grow as researchers examine more material and separate look-alike species with anatomy and DNA. New to science does not mean the animal popped into existence when a research ship arrived. What that phrase tells you is that nobody had formally identified and described it before. It is less magical, but much more useful. A species gets a name, a record, a place in the tree of life, and a chance to be protected before somebody turns its habitat into a spreadsheet. The early list included new rays, a deepwater cat shark, a chimera, and many invertebrates. You could see them as 8 seconds of weird footage, or you could see the larger point. Every one of those animals was already living in the dark while the rest of us were arguing about whether an old sonar blob looked like a spaceship. That is why the final answer is not the ocean is full of monsters. It is better than that. You are looking at mechanisms, animals, and places that seem invented because your everyday scale is too small for them. What you can keep is simple. The bloop was ice breaking. Julia was ice scraping. The Baltic anomaly is best treated as a natural formation, not evidence of visitors. A giant squid is real. A coelacanth never left. Hydrothermal vents run ecosystems without sunlight. Milky Seas can glow across an area as large as Iceland. And more than 110 species could be sitting in museum trays right now because a ship finally went looking. But you should not mistake that list for closure. NOAA's Upsweep sound still has no confirmed source. And in 2026, Seabed 2030 reported that only 28.7% of the global ocean floor had been mapped to its project standard. That is not an invitation to invent aliens. It is a reminder that the deep sea does not need help being mysterious. You already have icebergs that scream, fish that outlive their obituary, and oceans that glow in the dark. That is plenty. Go look at the water differently.